Hello everyone, welcome to SRIRAM'S IAS Daily News Analysis. Welcome to another session where we take up the important articles appearing in the Hindu newspaper and break them down from our UPSC perspective and extract the information which is useful for us from the exam point of view. With this, let's dive deep into the articles for today. So the articles which are appearing on your screen are taken from the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 3rd June. These are the 5 important articles. Let's start with taking up the first important article for the day. The first article which appears in the newspaper reads, "The Bihar government's caste count." Now this particular article pertains to the caste census or socio-economic caste census, the debate over which we are seeing from quite a period of time. Now what has happened, the Bihar cabinet has approved a 500 crore project of having a caste count in the state. Mind you, the words that are used are not a socio-economic caste census. The words that are being used are a caste count. So why this change of nomenclature? We'll look into it. So through this, we'll try to look into it why Bihar is indulging into a caste count. What is a socio-economic caste census? How is it different with the census? We'll try to answer these questions, and then we'll try to look at, are there any benefits of conducting such a caste count exercise, or what are the repercussions if they are, and how can they be solved? With this, let's try to understand the difference between census and a socio-economic caste census. When we talk about census, a census is a general exercise where we enumerate all the details of the citizens of the country. We list them down for formulating the policies better. The origin of the census in India goes back to the colonial exercise of 1881. So the first census that was done in India was in 1881 by the British government. The census has evolved and been used by the government, policymakers, academics and others to capture the Indian population, access resources, map social change and delimitation exercise. So the exercise of census becomes useful for all these activities for formulating policy, delimitation exercises and all of that. Plus, what is then a socio-economic caste census? So socio-economic caste census, one can say, is a sub-part of the census wherein the socio-economic data of the population is enumerated. So the SEC was conducted for the first time since 1931, and the last time SEC was conducted was in 2011. SEC is meant to canvass every Indian family, both in rural and urban India, and ask about their economic status. So it asks information about their economic status so as to allow central and state authorities to come up with a range of indicators of deprivation, permutation and combination of which could be used by each authority to define a poor or deprived person. So based on the information that the central or state government would receive about the economic status of the particular household or individual, they would get to know about the status of that individual, and hence they would be better able to formulate policies regarding that. It is also meant to ask every person their specific caste name to allow the government to re-evaluate which caste groups were economically worst off and which were better off. So we can see that the motive for asking the caste in the socio-economic caste census is to build a comprehensive database to understand what is the status of caste, and to re-evaluate which caste groups are worse off, which caste groups are better off economically as well as socially. So this is the primary motive of the socio-economic caste census. SEC has the potential to allow for a mapping of inequalities of a broader level. Right. Then we come to the difference between a census and a caste census. So what is the difference between census and SEC? The census provides a portrait of the Indian population, while the SEC is a tool to identify beneficiaries of state support. So the SEC has a very targeted motive. And another difference is that the census is conducted under the Census Act of 1948. Therefore, all data are considered confidential, whereas according to the SEC website, all the personal information given in the SEC is open for use. So that is the difference which we can see, which becomes important for us from the prelims point of view, where in the census, the information is confidential, and in the socio-economic caste census, the information is open for use by all government departments to grant or restrict benefits to the households. So this becomes a major difference between census and socio-economic caste census. Now, when we talk about holding such an exercise of enumerating the castes of people, are there any challenges involved in this? Are there any favorable points for conducting such a caste census? What are the challenges involved? Let's try to think on that. What can be the advantages of conducting such a caste census? In a country where we are plagued by caste inequalities, is it a wise exercise to count or recount the caste again of everyone? Is there any benefit involved in that, or are there only challenges involved because of which this exercise should not be done? Let's try to look at first what are the favorable points with respect to doing such a caste count exercise. Advantages of a caste census. Now, enumerating the castes of different people living in a region gives a comprehensive database which would enable to implement social equity programs and welfare measures. When we talk about enumerating the castes of different people, at least the favorable or the beneficial thing that the exercise does is it will build a comprehensive database where at least we'll come to know how many people in what kind of castes are situated where. So a objective database is a favorable point for such an exercise, especially in Bihar, where the caste count is going to happen, is known to be fragmented into several caste, subcastes, groups and communities. So in a state where there are various layers of distribution into castes and subcastes have happened, an exercise to enumerate or to calculate the various castes in the community can be a beneficial exercise. And then it is also useful for allotting resources. When we come to know by enumerating the different castes and their economic status, we will be better equipped to allot resources, we will be better equipped to bring objectivity to the debate of caste reservation, because we will be having objective information, correct information to assign as to how much benefit should be given to which caste. And apart from this, it is not only necessary to find out who are the underprivileged class, but it also will help us to find out who are the privileged class in the society or the privileged caste in the society. That will also be able to help us to find out. Now, these are some of the benefits that lie. But what are the challenges with respect to the caste census? As it turns out, experts point out a lot of challenges, because caste has an emotive element, and thus there exists the political and social repercussions of a caste census, where there have been concerns that counting caste may help solidify or harden identities. It may so happen that whilst we enumerate caste, and once it is on paper, rather than Ambedkar's vision of annihilating the caste altogether, it might harden or solidify in identities and inequalities, since we have now concrete information. So that can turn the beneficial point around its head, and it can become a serious challenge. Due to these repercussions, nearly a decade after the SEC, which was conducted in 2011, a sizable amount of its data remains unreleased or released only in parts. This is the reason why a lot of the data of the SEC of 2011 has not been put out, for the simple concern of this information might not be taken in the right manner and might harden or solidify identities and inequalities. Another challenge or issue with respect to this is that another census exercise can be costly and cumbersome. This is the, you can say, the justification given by the center in Supreme Court, when Supreme Court asked what are the challenges in front of center to conduct a caste census. The center said that it is administratively difficult and cumbersome. Then some experts also suggest that the usual census data or the normal census data already contains enough information for public policy design. So there is also a view which says that whatever information which is required to better analyze the data for policy design and for allotment of resources and for making favorable policies for the marginalized, there exists enough data in the usual census as only. So that is some of the issues which are flagged off as to point out that such a census, caste census exercise is not necessary. So these are the points which are on favor as well as against the conduction of caste census. Despite this, the Bihar government is going forward with the exercise and therefore calling it just a caste count, staying away from all this controversy, and has undertaken to complete this exercise in a year, allocating the resources by itself. Do let us know your views in the comments. What do you think? Is a caste census exercise favorable to conduct? Is it a good thing or a bad thing to conduct? Type your views in the comment box. With this, let's move on to our next article for the day. The next article which appears in the newspaper is China's growing footprint in the Pacific Islands. Now, why have we taken this article? This article becomes important for us from the GS2 syllabus, where effect of policies and politics of developed and developing countries on India's interests. So in the GS2 syllabus, whatever the other countries doing, if it has a significant bearing on India's policy, it becomes important for us to study. And China's activities in and around the Indian Ocean has in the often recent past become very important for us to study and analyze. In this respect, what has China done newly? It is now wanting to engage with the Pacific Island countries. What are the Pacific Island countries? It also becomes important for us from the UPSC point of view in the respect of mapping, where we need to be aware in terms of what these countries are, where are they situated from the mapping perspective. So let's try to understand first what are the Pacific Island countries, and then we'll get into China's activities and plans as to what it wants to do with these Pacific Island countries. So the Pacific Island countries, or PICs as we call them in for an abbreviation, are a cluster of 14 island states, right? They are situated in the tropical zone of Pacific Ocean between Australia, North America, right, in the Pacific Ocean. And these include the Cook Islands, Fiji, Kiribati, Republic of Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia or FSM, Nauru, Niue, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu and Vanuatu. Tonga Island is where the recent Tonga volcano eruption had also happened. Let's try to map them. See, these are the Pacific Island countries situated in the Pacific Ocean between Australia, the China as a country, and North America. These are the countries, 14 states divided then broadly into three set of islands. They are known as Micronesia, Melanesia and Polynesia. This is the grouping that is done on the basis of their proximity and human and physical geography. So their position becomes important for us from the mapping perspective, right? Three distinct parts, they are divided into Micronesia, Melanesia and Polynesia. Now, what is the significance of these islands? Though they are some of the smallest and least populated states, they have some of the largest exclusive economic zones or EEZs in the world. Now, what are exclusive economic zones? We are familiar, if you are familiar with the classification made in the United Nations laws for the seas. In that document, the three types of boundaries are enumerated. One is the territorial waters, one is the contiguous zone, and one is the exclusive economic zone. This is nothing but the boundaries are extended beyond the territories as well. So this is when from the shores 200 nautical miles are measured, that becomes a exclusive economic zones for these countries. and these island nations, though are small, have very large exclusive economic zones. And when we talk about having large ocean resources belonging to some countries, so then that translates into huge economic potential due to the possibility of utilizing the wealth of fisheries, energy, minerals and other marine resources present in such zones. So these island nations sit on extremely valuable fishery resources, energy resources and marine resources. So all of this makes them attractive for all countries to engage with, and that is why China is not the first one to engage with them, rather it is the new entrant into the Pacific island countries bloc. Before this, the West and other countries have been able to engage with them, and that is why China is now making a move to engage with them. Now what is China doing? Why is China engaging with the Pacific island countries? Recently, it also signed a security pact with the Solomon Islands, which is one of the states in the Pacific island countries. Now, what has China done? China recently met with a group, with the group of these 14 Pacific island countries and tried to formulate a security dialogue, which did not really materialize in this particular meet, but we'll try to look at, even though the meet did not fructify, did not materialize, what are China's interests, what is it trying to do with these Pacific island countries, what is India's role in here, what can India take away from this. So what is the need for China to engage with the Pacific island countries? With the growing presence of Quad, we know Quad is a grouping between India, Australia, Japan and which is the fourth country I'm forgetting? And USA, yes, sorry. Now with the growing presence of Quad, China feels the need to woo the Pacific island countries. Now we know that the Indo-Pacific region is coming in a lot of contention, where everyone is trying to stronghold their position. Therefore, China would want to take as many players into its side as it can, and therefore it feels the need to engage and woo the Pacific island countries. Second need is that if China invades Taiwan, with the Russia-Ukraine, with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, it seems very plausible that now China is going to do the same with Taiwan, and therefore it becomes important to break the Western domination of the island nations. Whatever hold the West or US is having over these island nations, China feels it's important that it needs to break this domination and take these island countries into its side, which could impede the reunification of China with Taiwan. So that also becomes a reason for China to engage with Pacific island countries. And like I said, in April 22, China signed a controversial security deal with the Solomon Islands, one of the 14 states in the Pacific island countries, which raised regional concerns. Now, though this meet has not materialized and China has not able to engage favorably as it would want to with these island nations, it is only with time that China brings certain favorable points for these countries and is able to get its way with these countries. Now, with respect to the examination, one other fact which is important for us to know as to what is India's engagement with these Pacific island countries. So, the grouping in this respect which is important for us to know is the Forum for India-Pacific Islands Cooperation, or FIPIC, a multinational grouping developed in 2014 for cooperation between India and the 14 Pacific islands which we are talking about, which include all these islands which we divided into Melanesia, Micronesia and Polynesia. And the heads of the state or heads of government of the above countries met in Suva, Fiji in November 2014 for the first time, where the annual summit was conceptualized. So for the exam point of view, the organization which can be asked in the examination is the Forum for India-Pacific Islands Cooperation. So I hope this issue was clear, where we were able to understand China's intentions with the Pacific island countries, what are the developments that are happening over there, and what is important for us from the exam point of view. With this, let's move on to the next article. The next article which appears in the newspaper is India-Israel seek links on futuristic defense tech. Now, this particular article highlights for us the importance of studying the bilateral relations of India and Israel, and they become important for us from the perspective of GS2 in syllabus, where we study bilateral and regional groupings and agreements involving India or affecting India's interests. So this is a bilateral relationship between India and Israel, which becomes very important for us to study. As we all know, Israel is a very strategic, crucial partner for India, where the partnership of India and Israel recently completed 30 years of diplomatic relations. In that respect, the two defense ministers of both countries have met, and they are now wanting to make a pact on futuristic defense technology. The relationship between India and Israel is in any way quite deep with respect to defense cooperation. Now they're going one level ahead by coming together for futuristic defense tech, where India's DRDO and the counterpart of Israel, Directorate for Defense R&D, will come together and research on futuristic defense tech. With this, let's also try to look at what are the other aspects of India-Israel relations for us, which are important from the exam point of view. So when we talk about India-Israel relations, there are broad areas which are very strong with India and Israel. What are those areas? First, we have very strong economic and commercial relations. From USD 200 million in 1992, the bilateral merchandise trade stood at USD 4.14 billion. So from 1992, the merchandise trade has increased to 4.14 billion. That is the amount of trade that happens between the two countries, which is excluding defense, which again forms a very important part of their trade during the period April 2020 to February 2021, with the balance of trade being in India's favor. So this is a beneficial point for India, where between the two countries, the balance of trade being in favor of India. What does this mean? What do we mean by balance of trade being in favor of India? It means that whatever India is exporting with respect to whatever it is importing from Israel, the exports are more than the imports. That is what is meant by balance of trade. And it is in India's favor, which means that India's exports to Israel are more than the imports. The trade in diamonds constitute about 50% of the bilateral trade. So a significant chunk of diamonds are exported to Israel by India. And India is Israel's third largest trade partner in Asia and seventh largest globally. So for Israel as well, we are a very important country, we are an important trade partner. Israeli companies have invested in India in energy, renewable energy, telecom, real estate, water technologies, and are focusing on setting up R&D centers, the news for which we just saw, or production units in India. India is also in dialogue with Israel for concluding a free trade agreement. When we sign a free trade agreement with some country, it gives special privileges and special provisions are made for facilitating the trade between two countries. So the talks for signing a free trade agreement is also going on. The next important area which India and Israel collaborate on in terms of trade is defense, where after Russia, Israel becomes the second largest supplier of military equipment, right? And for Israel, India is the largest buyer of military equipment from Israel, which in turn is the second largest defense supplier to India after Russia. So for Israel, we are the largest buyer, and for us, after Russia, the largest supplier is Israel. And the Indian armed forces have inducted a wide array of Israeli weapon systems over the years, which range from Falcon AWACS or airborne warning and control system. These are high-tech systems, and Heron, Searcher 2 and Harop drones. This particular meet between the two defense ministers is also focusing on UAVs, or what we call unmanned aerial vehicles, or simply known as drones. So we see that India and Israel share quite a deep relationship in defense ties. At the 15th Joint Working Group meeting on bilateral defense cooperation, countries agreed to form a task force to formulate a comprehensive 10-year roadmap to identify new areas of cooperation. So all these developments are happening in line to this only. Then, apart from the commercial relations, defense relations, the important areas also are agriculture, where India and Israel share a lot of trade in agriculture. In May 2021, a 3-year work program agreement for development in agriculture cooperation was signed. Israel is quite equipped in agriculture, and we get help from them a lot of times in bringing futuristic technologies for agriculture. Then science and technology, with respect to science and technology also India and Israel share a lot of trade relationships. Experts from India and Israel deliberated on widening the scope of India-Israel Industrial Research and Development and Technological Innovation Fund, which is also known as I4F, at its 8th governing body meeting. They approved 3 joint R&D projects worth $5.5 million and suggested measures to create a broader India-Israel collaborative ecosystem. So we can see that on all these fronts, India and Israel are quite tied up with respect to their trade relations. And other areas, Israel is also joining the India-led International Solar Alliance, right? We know that International Solar Alliance is an initiative spearheaded by India, which Israel has shown a lot of interest, which aligns very well with the objectives of both countries to scale up the cooperation in renewable energy and partner in clean energy. So we can see that the areas which converge for India and Israel are into the commercial relations, defense relations, agriculture, technology, which involves research and development, and renewable energy, right? These are the areas which we broadly need to remember and look at when we look at India-Israel relations, right? With this, let's move on to our next article for the day. The next article which appears in the newspaper is trade deficit widened to a record $23.33 billion last month. Now, this article talks about the trade deficit, which is widened to a record $23.33 billion last month. Now, what is important for us in this article? First of all, it forms a part for us to study from the GS3 syllabus point of view, where we see Indian economy and issues relating to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. Now, when we talk about this article, let's look at a previous year question paper that appeared in 2020 prelims paper, which talked about the same thing that is being talked about in the article, which is about India's merchandise exports are less than its merchandise imports, right? Then India suffers from an overall trade or current account deficit. All of this information is frequently asked in the prelims paper. So what is important for us to look at in this article? What we need to look at is that the trade deficit has widened to 23.33 billion, which means that India's exports with respect to its imports have been very low. The imports have risen highly. The imports have risen to it has jumped 56% from 37 billion to 60 billion. That's the count for imports. And the exports have only grown by 15%. Right? So this is the data which we need to look at when we talk about the trade deficit. We need to understand what is trade deficit. Like I've also mentioned before, trade deficit means the difference between the country's export and country's import. That is what is meant by trade deficit. Right? That was what was important in this article. With this, let's move on to the next article. The next article which appears in the newspaper titles Drilling Down. Now, what do we mean by drilling down and what does this data suggest? This is a data pertaining to the crude oil measures or crude oil resources in India. We know that due to the Russia-Ukraine war, the crude oil prices in the international market have surged up unprecedentedly. A barrel of crude oil is becoming very costly. I think more than $120 and upwards from that. So India has had to import a lot of crude oil. In fact, India's 85% crude oil has to be imported. India imports 85% of its crude oil needs and about half of its natural gas requirement, right? So, and why is this important? Why is crude oil important? Crude oil is a basic fundamental component for all kinds of industries. It is a fuel that gets converted into petrol, diesel and natural gas. That is why it becomes a very fundamental fuel and a fundamental component for various other industries. That is why the importance of crude oil is quite high. But when 85% of India's crude oil needs are to be imported, it increases the import bill for India and increases again the trade deficit. So we can link this to the last article where the reasons for India's trade deficit increase can be attributed to the high prices of crude oil. So now this article talks about the fact that with respect to crude oil resources, where India is facing crunch in importing the crude oil, and we know that in order to import crude oil, we need to spend forex reserves, we need to spend dollars which are situated in our forex reserves, and we need to, and more spending of the dollars can be very harmful as well. So that is why what the article tries to point out, what are the challenges due to which 85% of crude oil needs are to be imported, and what are the reasons as to why there aren't sufficient resources or sufficient viable means of crude oil resources in India for India to extract. The reasons for them, which the article says, is that first is falling output, or the existing companies which are extracting oil from the crude oil reserves, their output has been falling. The amount of crude oil they have been extracting over the years, they have been falling. And the reason for that is, one reason which they say is aging wells, which means that the oil wells from which we are extracting oil, they are aging, they are getting old, and new discoveries of new oils have not been really happened. So that is said as one reason. The other is, of course, that we talked about import dependence. Because of this, the lack of favorable and viable resources being in India, we have to import a lot of our crude oil. And the fourth reason which is said is the ONGC's woes, or we can also say that the sector of crude oil extraction is dominated by only two state-owned companies, which the biggest of which is ONGC. And now ONGC is also not able to give that much output for crude oil. So these are the reasons which we can understand for India's crude oil woes, and the problems which India is facing, which spirals down into a lot of problems internationally for India. So we can cite these reasons whenever a question comes on crude oil, or what are the reasons for importing a high amount of crude oil and not being viable resources in India. With this, we come to end of today's discussion. If you have any doubt, you can post it in the comment box below. We'll meet tomorrow. Thank you.